I really don't even know where to begin with this game. I have so many memories, and in fact, I'll generally play through this game once every year or two, depending on when I feel I have forgotten enough of the game for it to be challenging to play through again. I would estimate that I've beaten the game around a dozen times, a few times on Dreamcast, a few times on PlayStation, and once on Nintendo 64. Recently I purchased the Steam version, and I'm looking forward to playing that soon, as the PC is the intended version, and all of the console versions are actually ports with varying levels of content missing, but we'll talk about that later. As for me, I was exposed to this game very randomly. I was spending the summer with my mother in either 2001 or 2002, and her roommate gave me this game on PlayStation, and I was instantly hooked. By the way, thank you, Boo. I hope life has been treating you well. I loved the lonely, desolate atmosphere, and remember thinking Jaunty was absolutely hilarious. Soon I was nearly obsessed with playing the game, as I found the reward for exploration to be beyond anything I had experienced in any game up to that point, and honestly, that feeling holds up all these years and games later. This is absolutely my favorite game of all time. I love it so much. I've even given 3 or 4 copies of the game away for free just so other people could experience it, in the hopes that they'll love it as much as I do. I wrote a really long review of this game for a project in high school, which has unfortunately long since been lost, and I've been wanting to make a review about it for a very long time now, but I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. Hopefully I didn't, but as any reviewer knows, you'll always think of a ton of things you wanted to say as soon as you publish your review. Speaking of reviews, check at the end of this video for a link to the review I made about the sequel to this game. Coming soon is a second part of that video, made up of things I forgot to say the first time around. Also, I am incredibly happy to hear that Night Dive Studios is currently working on a remaster of this game, and it's due to release in 2021 for Switch, PS4, Xbox One, and PC. I have not ever been this excited for a game release in my life at any point. They're planning to also add some of the cut content into the remaster, and if you didn't know, there were a few levels that were axed, as you can see in this beta footage. If anyone who is involved is watching this video, please come out with some sort of collector's edition. I'll buy 3, Switch, PS4, and PC. I might even buy the extra copies just for the hell of it. Posters, shirts, figures, an official audio CD of Tim Haywood's genius soundtrack. I will literally buy it all.
Shut up and take my money!
Now that I've gushed over it, let's let the man himself give you the basics.
For many thousands of years, the Shadow Men have protected the world of the living against threats crossing over from the spiritual plane known as Deadside, the place where everyone goes without exception when they die. Michael Leroy is the current heir to the mysteries of this ancient lineage, bearer of the Mask of Shadows. When darkness falls, he becomes the walker between the worlds, immortal voodoo warrior, taker of souls, lord of Deadside, the Shadow Man.
The game is a third-person action/adventure/horror game with action, puzzle, and platforming elements. You play as a man named Michael, a normal man by day who becomes Shadow Man, an immortal badass demon slayer, by night. The game manages to avoid using any kind of horror genre cliches and provides a fresh take on the concept by incorporating heavy voodoo influences in a diverse and unconventional cast of characters. Shadow Man features many things that were still considered groundbreaking around the time of its release in 1999. While not the first game to feature cutscenes and full dialogue, it opens beautifully with 3 cutscenes that set the story in motion. The voice acting is also really good. It's not quite on the level of Metal Gear Solid, but far beyond the likes of the first Resident Evil. Red Pepper as Shadow Man is still to this day one of the best casting decisions of all times as it pertains to voice acting.
Something is coming. Something big.
And the other characters are represented quite well by their voice actors. My absolute favorite, aside from Shadow Man, is the hilariously cheesy Southern American drawl given to Milton Pike, the video nasty killer. It's a British man exaggerating an impersonation of an already exaggerated stereotype of Southern Americans, and it's so hilarious that I'm always deeply saddened when the cutscene ends.
Hey, you! This is private property. What the hell you think you're doing, boy?
I ain't your boy.
I also like how, throughout the game, Shadow Man has a few one-liners pertaining to enemies or environments or objects. The occurrence of these voiceovers completely depend on which version of the game you are playing. PC version has the most, PlayStation version pretty much doesn't have any.
The power of the Dark Souls.
I completely believe that you are missing out if you do not play this game. If you don't believe me, you can check out the ratings this game received upon release. Most versions of the game received pretty positive reviews across the board, with one glaring exception. Shadow Man was released on Dreamcast, PC, N64, and the original PlayStation. Unless you have absolutely no other option, avoid the PS1 version at all costs. The game is not completely broken, but the controls and some of the frame rate issues, and there are some other issues, it's pretty much just the worst version. Stick with the other options, and if you're primarily a console gamer, I would suggest playing it on the Dreamcast as it's closer to the PC version, which, as previously mentioned, is the complete version of the game. The Dreamcast version goes for somewhere around $10 to $15 online or in physical stores. On the Dreamcast version, there are some issues with sounds not working properly, and there's also an annoying little freeze that happens whenever a new music track loads, but as someone who has played each version multiple times, I'll go with the Dreamcast over the N64. The N64 version is also very good, and maybe it's just me, but I didn't enjoy playing it on the original N64 controller at all. Personal nitpick, and you won't be missing anything of vital importance if you do decide to go the N64 route, with the exception of slightly lesser quality in the audio department, which was pretty much standard for N64 ports. Plus, the N64 version is also very affordable. But if you have a computer, the game is very cheap on Steam and isn't very demanding, so pretty much any computer these days can handle it. I can play it on a 2015 MacBook Pro, so you should be able to find a way that works for you. There are also some amazing mods if you're into that sort of thing. For sake of transparency, I played through this game on Dreamcast, and that's the footage I am using for this review. If for any reason I do use footage from another version of the game, you will see that console's logo in the bottom of the screen. Let's start off with the story. I will intentionally be somewhat vague, as I want you to still have some things to discover if and when you play through this game on your own. We begin in London. Jack the Ripper is writing in his journal about his sadness and not finding the soul within the victims he murdered when he is confronted by the game's main antagonist and final boss, Legion. After a very short conversation loaded with crucial information, Jack the Ripper is convinced by a complete stranger to stab himself in the gut so that he can die and cross over to Deadside and build what is essentially the central hub world that leads to 5 of the 6 boss fights in the game, the Cathedral of Pain.
Amen to that.
In the next scene, we see the main protagonist, Shadow Man, and one of the supporting characters, Nettie, sleeping in a bed with no pillows or blankets, when Nettie is awoken by a bad dream about the 6 evil characters in the game. Here is where you'll receive the most vital exposition pertaining to your involvement in the story as Shadow Man. Essentially, as you could likely predict, you have to stop these bad dudes from doing stuff that bad dudes do. Nothing less, nothing more from a plot perspective.
Okay, so let me get this straight. If I don't recover these Dark Souls, then the world's gonna end. Am I right?
You got it.
Shit.
The final cutscene before you begin is one where you'll learn the backstory of Mike and Shadow Man and why they are in this position in the first place. You'll miss nothing vital by skipping this final scene, but I always appreciated the way these opening cutscenes were handled. They all served a purpose and complemented one another well enough to give you a good enough grasp of the situation and what your motives are supposed to be as a player. Right out of the gate, you also have some great supplemental reading material in your inventory that will tell you more about the lore of the game and its characters, which was always intriguing to me. Side note, another YouTuber made a great video about the possible connections between the killers in the game and the inspirations from real life. You'll see a link to that in the top corner as I speak. Not too long after your journey begins, you'll meet the other supporting character, Jaunty, who guards the gates that lead to the rest of the game. This guy is absolutely hilarious. Once he opens the gate for you after being asked repeatedly, you'll be embarking on a very long journey throughout different sections of Deadside and beyond. This is a very long game during your first run, and will still likely take many hours even during repeat playthroughs, especially if you decide to collect everything the game has to offer. For a game of its time, you have a surprising amount of freedom over exactly how you want to progress and complete the game. It's not quite as splintered as the multiple choice branching pathways in Resident Evil 3 or anything, but you don't even have to collect all of the items to beat the final boss in the game. However, there are really only 2 endings, and they're dictated by your performance in the final fight with Legion. This game is absolutely massive. Most of these levels require backtracking, and some of them even require a minimum of 4 visits. You get a glimpse of backtracking elements almost immediately when you decide to snoop around the swamps in Louisiana. You'll see these strange pulsating objects hidden at the very beginning of the first level, and later in the same level you'll see another one trapped inside of a building. Later, you'll see them in the church. Get used to seeing items you can't collect yet, and gates you can't open yet because they are everywhere. For example, there are sections of the engine block level that you can only access through hidden doorways beyond the locations where you fight some of these serial killers. More on that later. No need to really worry about it though, because the backtracking never really feels tedious. It's less like Metal Gear Solid's sniper rifle and Nikita retrieval missions, which just exist to pad out what's ultimately a very small map, and more like running around the first few Resident Evil games once you found new items which will grant you access to rooms that you could not visit before. It doesn't feel cheap like the former, and much like the latter, it benefits from a feeling of completion and discovery. It just always feels like a fun time, and most of the levels are absolutely packed with hidden pathways, doors, and items around each corner. There is very minimal dead space anywhere in the game, and everything leads to something, either a new pathway or a new item, something. Many would say that the best element of this game is the atmosphere. It is what makes this game so different from almost anything else at the time. This game is very dark and creepy without relying on jump scares. Many of the characters scream when they are damaged and killed, and they explode into a pool of blood depending on which weapon you use to kill them. The visuals are nightmarish, and the music is some of the best to ever be used in a game. No kidding, just click the link in the top right corner. I'm not going to play it here as it will result in a copyright claim, but Tim Haywood's musical direction has been praised many times by critics and fans alike, and for good reason. Kudos to you, Mr. Haywood, and thanks for all the nightmares during my teenage years. Release it on a physical CD with artwork and I'll buy a few copies, hint hint. I'll give you money. It's also very important to mention that Shadow Man doesn't technically die by definition. However, if you lose all of your health, you'll be forced to restart a level from either the very beginning or the teddy bear warp point. You'll still be in possession of any items you found inside the level, and many of the pickups you grabbed or enemies you previously killed will still be gone. However, enemies' health and voodoo pickups will essentially respawn if you go from one level to the other. Back to it. Good atmosphere with mediocre gameplay can only take you so far. So what about the other elements? There are many collectibles, some of which serve a single purpose within the confines of certain areas like the Engineer's Key, and some of which serve a dual purpose as both weapons and key items. While many of these weapons and items are never required, certain things are mandatory to progress within the game, the most important being the Dark Souls. These are the MacGuffins of the game. Collecting them is essential to the plot because this is what increases your shadow powers and in turn allows you to access new areas and obtain new items. Your maximum voodoo level is also directly correlated to your level of shadow power. There are a total of 120 Dark Souls in the game, with the majority of them being scattered throughout the levels, a handful of others being contained within monsters known as true forms, and some of them from the boss encounters. If you ever wonder how many more you'll need to get to the next level of your shadow powers, refer to the prophecy. There is a handy guide that shows you how many you'll need to power up to the next level. Coffin gates are the main roadblocks to the areas and items you'll need to uncover as you progress. You'll see these scattered all throughout Deadside, and there are 10 different power levels you'll see when you find these. You can only open coffin gates that are equal to or lesser than your overall shadow powers, so keep a mental note of these because you'll see plenty that you have to return to later. Cadeaux are also important to your progress if you'd like to have more overall hit points. There are over 500 of these scattered throughout the game, and you must present 100 of them at a time at the altars of the Loa to gain one additional slot of maximum health, of which there are 5 total upgrades. These are not required, but are very nice if you do decide to go out of your way for them. However, many of them are in plain sight, so you'll easily be able to earn a few of the upgrades just by running through the game as you usually would. Later on, you'll collect retractors, which are used to open up the portals leading to the 5 serial killers. There are other items dropped by 3 of the bosses, and I'll talk about that later. You'll quickly discover that there's a lot to collect here, some essential, some optional, but all rewarding and satisfying. The strangest item, in my opinion, is the teddy bear. I understand that the developers needed an excuse to give you an item you could use for fast travel between levels, but this was always just unsettling to me. It belonged to your now dead brother and serves as your link between live side and dead side. Not sure why, but that always seemed really off-putting. Anyhow, you'll be using this item to warp between sections of the game that contain teddy bear warp points. When you encounter one of these, you'll see the bear flash on screen for a second, and Mike will let out a little gasp, and you'll now have a new spot that you can travel to from anywhere else in the game at any time that you see fit. There are several enemy types you'll encounter throughout the game, and they range from non-threatening and annoying to mildly dangerous to holy motherfucking shit. Each section of the game has its own enemies. For example, the surgeons are only found within certain parts of the asylum, prisoners obviously only within the prison, and the Sisters of Blood are only found within the Gad temples. This helps to add a certain level of distinction to the different areas and sections within the game, and paired with the changes in music, set pieces, and color schemes, keep the game from feeling monotonous during your seemingly endless hours of exploration, collection, and puzzle solving. There aren't too many characters in the game, and this helps to keep the focus where it matters with a minimal amount of fluff and/or confusion. On the good side, there's Mike / Shadowman, Nettie, and Jaunty. As far as Nettie and Jaunty, they serve what is essentially very little purpose as far as progression outside of one major contribution from each. Nettie helps to explain a lot of the mechanics in the game, but beyond that, her only real purpose is to use the Eclipse blade later in the game after a brief sex scene. She is of no use after this scene and is essentially comatose. In other words, you literally f*** her into a coma. Following the theme of single-use supporting characters, aside from opening the gates at the very beginning of the game, Jaunty offers essentially nothing but small talk. I wish Jaunty would have been given more dialogue, especially if he could provide a few actual hints when you're lost, but I'll settle for this at the end of the day. Now on the bad side of the spectrum, you'll first encounter 3 prisoners, an architect, and a psychotic mama's boy. These characters are known as the Five, and they serve as some of the boss fights of this game. You'll notice they are all contained within live side locations, but this is actually important from a gameplay perspective. As a payoff for what is essentially a fetch quest of the 3 parts of an ancient blade, nightfall covers the earth and you are finally able to use your shadow powers to vanquish these enemies. Your shadow powers are a requirement because each of these characters contain a dark soul within and as such cannot be killed by ordinary weapons. You can access these levels as just base level Mike, but there's really no reason in doing so. Now, as far as the characters I mentioned, Milton Pike is a seemingly racist war veteran who's kind of a douchebag. Marco Cruz is an old disco fan who, despite actually being somewhat likable, is also a douchebag. Dr. Batrachian, the leader of the Five, is very angry at Shadowman's arrogance and is also, you guessed it, a douchebag. Jack the Ripper is the toughest member of the Five, but ultimately is also a douchebag. Avery Marks, the last member of the Five, who is also the weirdest by a long shot, clearly suffers from mental issues, has huge mommy issues, and also suffers from douchebaggeritis. Last but not least, Legion, who puts the douche and the bag in the word douchebag. This guy is a smug little asshole, and you later learn that the entire game was a ruse set up by him in order for you to collect the Dark Souls to bring to him. Yes, he wrote the prophecy. He planted the seed in Nettie's head that caused her to have the nightmare. Yes, he manipulated you into thinking you were seeing and hearing Luke, and we learned this all in one greatly unsettling cutscene. Seriously, the joke scene freaked me the f*** out when I was a kid.
Hey, you wanna hear a joke, Mikey?
Sure.
Once upon a time, there was a murderer and his victim walking hand in hand towards some deep, dark woods. The victim squeezes the murderer's hand real tight. He says, looking up pleadingly with his big brown eyes. I'm really scared, mister, of the deep, dark woods.
Luke, what the hell?
He sighs and he says, you're scared? How the hell do you think I feel?
I'm gonna be walking back through them on my own. Pretty funny, hey, Mikey. Pretty goddamn amusing, don't you think? What the fuck was that?
There are 17 total levels, all of which are sensibly linked together in-game, which gives the adventure a nice sense of cohesion. 4 of the levels exist within the real world, with the remaining 13 existing within Deadside. 7 of the levels occur in or around the Asylum, which acts as the link between you and the game's bosses. As soon as you begin to tire of one theme, you'll be greeted with another. The pacing of the game is handled very well. The remaining levels see you running around in Deadside solving puzzles, platforming, and collecting items that will help you to level up and become stronger and access new areas. 3 of the levels are huge temples that, upon completion, grant Shadow Man the ability to either touch burning surfaces, walk on hot coals, or swim in lava. The temples also contain these doors that look strangely like assholes. These, in my opinion, are some of the best levels I have ever played and simultaneously the most f***ing frustrating. You'll also notice that whether in the form of ropes you can cross to skip large canyon areas, baton receptacles, paths you can unblock, doors you can unlock with the engineer's key, or even the previously mentioned teddy bear warp points, the developers understood the massive amount of time these levels required, and they throw you a bone or two in the form of fast travel. You'll still not want to die, and you'll want to be careful to not miss jumps or ledges, but you won't lose an unreasonable amount of time if you do end up dying and having to replay sections of the game. There are 2 perfect examples I can think of offhand. One is the second Gad Temple. You can push this block from the inside and end up skipping a large chunk of the level later when you return here and or die. As far as the teddy bear points, the warp point in the playrooms puts you in the absolute perfect position to be able to branch off in any of the many directions you'll need to explore to collect everything. This is put in the absolute perfect place. You'll start off in Louisiana searching for a church where Mama Nettie is waiting for you. I always loved how you could see the big church on the hill in the distance, and how this game didn't use fog to cover things off in the distance. Not much to do here at first except for run down one of the most linear paths in the game as you progress to a cave and climb over a ledge right in front of the church, and excuse me, but what the hell? Who could ever make it up here? I mentioned this in my review of the sequel, but I always thought this was really weird. Unless there's something I'm missing or forgetting, this is the only way to get to the church. Anyway, after receiving your gun from Nettie, you can explore if you want, but you're a bit limited in what you can do as you can't release the Dark Souls. You don't yet have the baton, which would require voodoo anyway, and Mike can drown easily. Later on, you'll be able to revisit as Shadow Man, and you'll find much enjoyment out of the basic yet rewarding exploration as you find Dark Souls, Cadeau, and one of the 2 shotguns you'll find in the game. Shortly thereafter, you'll begin to explore Deadside, and this is when you'll begin to notice the sheer scope and massive size of this game. You'll notice that you can see a giant tower in the background. It'll take you a decent bit of time to get there, and on your way you'll become familiar with the gameplay and atmosphere for Deadside. There will be increasingly more and more for you to do as you become more powerful and return to any one of the many warp points around here, so get used to the scenery. I adore the wasteland sections of this game. So barren yet so interesting, and there is something hidden around literally every corner, be it above the bloodfalls, in hidden caverns that require you to swim to them, or just beyond reach until you can overcome whichever hurdle is holding you back. My favorite part of this entire section is the windmill puzzle. I'm not exactly sure why, but I absolutely love it. Somewhere within your first hour or 2, you'll finally make it up to the huge tower you saw earlier. The same one Jonty told you about. Holy hell, this place is massive. This is, of course, the Asylum. And this will be the gateway to the majority of the game from this point forward if you include the portals within the Cathedral of Pain. Get ready, as even getting into this building will take you some time and patience. Once you're inside, you'll have your hands full with different types of enemies, some who can melee attack you, some who will shoot you, and the creepy little weaklings from earlier who can suck your life force from you if you're close enough. You'll eventually make it to all kinds of places, more importantly to the overall plot being the Cathedral of Pain. The Cathedral of Pain is a level that seems short on the surface, but as you gain more of the GAD immunities, you'll discover just how much this place is hiding. Side note, it's also one of the levels where you'll notice big differences depending on which version of the game you're playing. Once you emerge from the trolley, you'll see 2 or 3 doorways depending on which version of the game. On the PlayStation 1, you'll be missing a doorway midway through the wall on the right side of the room. On the Dreamcast and PC versions, you'll also notice a doorway leading to a theater where you can learn about the uses of retractors that lie just ahead. Not sure about the N64 version of the game as I've only played through it once and no longer own it. You'll also notice there's a giant hole in the floor in the other versions that is absent in the PS1 version. Again, I'm not sure about the 64. Anyway, you'll be able to warp to any of the 5 bosses once you find some of the retractors later on. These bosses are the ones referenced in the file Nettie gives you at the very start of the game. These portals will take you to a prison in Texas, a dilapidated apartment building in New York, and an underground train station in London to fight the bosses that we spoke about earlier. You can already access 2 of the portals if you so choose, but upon your first visit to the cathedral, there's no real reason to do so. Side note, I recommend visiting London first when you acquire your first retractor, as Jack's journal contains some very important information about the combinations needed to shut down the pistons in the engine room. Speaking of London, this is a very large area. I really enjoy the vibe from this level. I enjoy the staircase, which clearly wasn't there in the intro cutscene, and most of all I enjoy the fact that if you so choose, you can actually skip the majority of this level and face Jack without so much as triggering the teddy bear warp point. I love this level, but I will say that it's one of the levels that kind of toes the line of boredom occasionally. This area is saved by the music. The level also feels very lonely and disconnected from the rest of the world, which leads to a sense of shared emptiness between yourself as the player and Jack, who must have been feeling quite low if a few seconds of conversation with a total stranger was enough to convince him to commit suicide. The fast forward footage I just showed you was the path you can take to skip half the level to get straight to Jack. If you notice here, I have defeated Jack and I do not have the London teddy bear point. That also means I didn't have footage of the rest of the levels, so I hope you enjoyed.
Happy birthday, dumbass.
I also loved the overall feeling of sadness I experienced playing this level, and it was all thanks to the music and lack of enemies except for a few dogs later on. The guy lives in a tiny room hidden in the sewers. The whole thing gives off an aura of unwelcome anxiety, and I look forward to that every time I play the game again. Once you've defeated Jack, he will leave behind a prism which can be used to access another portion of the engine block through a gateway in the back of the area where you fight him. The prison is home to Milton Pike, the video nasty killer, Marco Cruz, the repo man, and last but not least, Dr. Victor Batrachian, the Lizard King, who to me seems to be clearly modeled after Hannibal Lecter. All 3 of them have their own portals within the cathedral, but the Lizard King is the only one that actually requires you to complete the whole prison level to access and fight, and is also the only prisoner who drops a prism. I love this level. It's one of my favorites, and I remember being completely creeped out as a child when I would see the prisoners stand up just to have their heads explode. Also, these guys are very good at aiming to be headless, and I think maybe the Empire should recruit them, as they can actually hit a target and you'd save money on helmets. I'm pretty sure that this is the shortest free throw in history. There's also a helicopter that you can either choose to fight or run from. Also, the keycard. What the f***? Why does Shadow Man keep the entire hand? I always thought this was hilarious. Kinda makes me wish you could use it as a melee weapon to bitch slap enemies. The rundown apartment building is one of the creepier levels in the game. I think it's very cool that you actually have to turn on the electricity to the building, which is foreshadowed in both Nettie's file and Avery's room inside the cathedral. I always loved the feeling of running through an abandoned apartment complex, which is even more lonely than the train station in London. This level is a maze of strange things painted on the walls, dead ends, trapdoors, bloody bathrooms, rooms full of dead people holding radios, elevator rides, and an actual literal maze that leads you to the final area where you have your showdown with Avery. Much like Batrachian and Jack the Ripper, Avery will leave behind a prism. The other levels are mostly areas within the Asylum, with my favorite being either the playrooms or the Undercity, and least favorite of the entire game easily being the lava ducts. The playrooms have my favorite music and also the most rewarding exploration out of any of the levels in the Asylum. There is literally a bright and colorful room with a playpen, and hilariously enough, an enemy is trapped inside of it. Also, the dollar bill room is incredibly unnerving. A bloody cash register with blood on the walls which reads, "In God We Trust." If you needed proof that Tim Haywood is a genius, look no further. The room contains only backmasked laughter and might be the scariest room of the game. Hopefully you're not playing on the PlayStation version of the game because this is missing. There are 3 large temples within the game that, upon completion, will grant Shadow Man one of 3 levels of immunity to burn damage. As I said earlier, these are both equally fun and frustrating. And also, as I said earlier, backtracking is a huge element to this game, and if you need an example, just look at the first Gad temple. You have to complete this level the first time to gain the ability to touch burning objects. You return later once you can walk on the lava coals. You return later once you can swim in the lava. Again, you return once you have the baton and can transport through an altar. And then you must return the final time when you have the calabash and can bust through the Veve floor tiles. That's 5 visits just for this one stage, and that doesn't even account for all the work you had to do to get up here in the first place. The object of these 3 temples is to obtain sacred markings which will protect you from various degrees of burn damage. First, you can touch flaming hot surfaces, later you can run on hot coals, and then you can totally submerge yourself in lava. These are some of the most densely packed levels I've ever played in any game, and as I previously mentioned, they all require a handful of return visits once new powers and items are acquired. These are also easily the most challenging levels in the game, particularly the final temple. One wrong move means your death, and this goes throughout the entire level until you receive the tattoo. Again, I want to give major props to the development team for a compelling and rewarding use of backtracking as we discussed earlier. One of the most important levels in the game is actually one of the shortest, and that's the engine block. You'll see 4 pistons ahead of you, one on the left side of the room and the other 3 protruding from the right side. This is significant because it suggests you can only control a single piston from within this part of the level. The other 3 pistons are accessed by using an item left behind by certain bosses. You don't know this at the time, but at the other end of this room lies the doorway to the final confrontation with Legion, meaning it is also the next to last section of the game you'll play before completion. The last area of the game is a huge arena where you'll finally get to face off with Legion. Not much to see here, and even less to see if you're playing on the PlayStation version, as the floor doesn't collapse in the second half of the fight. Save before this fight, I'm just saying. I've gushed over the game for a while now. It's time to discuss some of the flaws. Some of these might be nitpicks, and if you can think of anything I missed, the comment section is always open. Unfortunately, the controls are one of the things about the game that show its age. The movement can be very stiff, which is probably because he sleeps with no pillow, but by the time you get to the point in the game where the difficult platforming begins, you'll probably have a good enough grasp of what you're doing. Turning is often uncomfortably stiff, but the controls work well within the context of the game, even if they're primitive by today's standards. Overall, though, they are pretty solid, especially from a time where 3D action-adventure games were still in their infancy. However, I want to take a pit stop here to dishonorably mention the PlayStation version. This version has the most unresponsive controls of any game I remember playing on the first PlayStation. I had told you to avoid the game, and if you look on screen, you'll see why. Just stay away from this version. Look how ugly it is anyway. In fact, let's take a second to compare the exact same place in the PC and PlayStation versions of the game. Some of the enemies in Deadside can actually fire projectile weapons up or down at you in the actual versions of the game, but in the PlayStation version, they can only fire straight forward. I rest my case. And can you believe that when I was bouncing from couch to couch in 2018, I actually played all the way through this game on a PlayStation Portable? Now that we're finished talking about that ungodly abomination, let's get back to the controls. They are responsive, and Shadow Man has a good weight to him. There are very few sections of the game where it is actually hard to judge how far forward you're supposed to jump to another platform or ledge. Shadow Man is also one of the earliest games that allows the player to lock on and strafe around a target while you're firing. This will help you when you are surrounded by enemies and will most definitely come in handy when you encounter anything that can fly and shoot projectiles at you. Overall, the controls are simple and you'll feel very comfortable after just a few minutes of play. Despite the flaws, I believe it controls better than other similar games from its time like Tomb Raider or Legacy of Kain: Soul Reaver. Another component to the game that has aged somewhat poorly is the combat system. You strafe and fire, and then when you're done with that, you advance to another encounter where you'll strafe and fire. Once you've strafed and fired some more, you'll continue to strafe and fire. You do have a decently sized arsenal of weapons and equipment, and some of them will temporarily break the monotony, but you'll mostly be using the Shadow Gun, as it's the only weapon that can actually kill the more powerful enemies in the game and also causes dead enemies to leave behind a small amount of health for you. I usually just roll through the game with the Shadow Gun in one hand and the other hand open to either context-sensitive items or the shield, or in the fight with Legion, the Violator. Now for a couple nitpicks. Shadow Man easily can jump over these pistons. Look at that, it's like ankle high. Why couldn't Shadow Man just wait until nighttime to fight the 5? He had to spend so many hours looking for the Eclipse blade that it would have been nighttime in live side anyway. There's a rope that goes across this room to connect one side to the other, and there's this tiny little hook on it that Shadow Man actually can't just reach around. There's a switch you can flip on the other side of the room that removes the hook, and that's nice for quick travel, but really, you can't really suspend your disbelief enough. There are probably more, but that's all I can really remember at the moment. Now I'm putting this here because I didn't know where else to stick it in the video, but if you play this on the PlayStation, there's a little trick that I couldn't get to work on any other version of the game. You can actually travel across lava without having the proper protection in certain areas. The trick is to gently transition between the floor and the lava, and to just quickly tap in whichever direction you want to go without actually registering a full step. Using this trick, you can actually access levels way earlier than intended. Now, I remember being able to get some of the GAD tattoos out of sequence, but I haven't been able to figure that out recently. But if I do figure that out, I will make a video about it because I remember Shadow Man's appearance being incredibly glitchy. It was actually kind of cool. Also on the PlayStation version, there were times that I completely fell through the ground in the wasteland area and infinitely dropped into a void of nothingness, but this was years ago and I don't have any footage of it. Also, when playing the Sega Dreamcast version, a lot of times the Shadow Gun sound wouldn't go off. I would just hear a click. The Dreamcast version also seemed to be the most inconsistent with staying locked onto a character as I was strafing. Strangely enough, the best performance of this mechanic is actually the PlayStation version. On console, at least in my experience. Also, the Sega Dreamcast VMU, you can see the little screen in the window on the Dreamcast controller. It shows Luke's teddy bear. I always thought that was kind of cool. Another unintended thing you can do is to kill Milton before you actually trigger the cutscene, so long as you do not actually step out of the doorway and into his area of the prison. He will be standing close enough that you can repeatedly unload fully charged shots from your Shadow Gun without retaliation. Something else I noticed, which is relatively pointless, is that Mike seems to have a hard time pulling himself up over a ledge, and Shadow Man is just like, F it, and flings himself over ledges. So overall, I love this game so much. In fact, it's the only game I really care about collecting for. I have the Mask of Shadows tattooed on my forearm, and even suffered through an excruciating playthrough on the PSP because I had no other option at the time, and you know what? I ended up enjoying it anyway. This game is far from perfect, but I adore every bit of it. Maybe it's just me, but I find the middle segment of the lava duct area to be very tedious, but out of 17 levels, not being in love with only one part of one of them is a great success record, not even rivaled by any of my other favorite games with the exception of maybe Time Splitter's Future Perfect on a good day. I don't have any issues with any of the huge levels, the backtracking, the environments, and I love the soundtrack. I am a little iffy on the combat and controls, but throughout the vast majority of your runtime, they'll work just fine. I don't mind getting lost in this game because I love the environments and atmosphere so much. I love the feeling of satisfaction when I can finally backtrack to a high-level coffin gate that I couldn't open before, running across hot coals and jumping into lava to further explore levels and collect more Dark Souls. I love getting to fight the 5 again and again before kicking the absolute dog shit out of Legion. I love watching the inventory fill up with weapons and items, same with the levels inside of the teddy bear menu. I also found it cool that Shadow Man's glowing eyes gradually grew bigger and bigger into the entire Shadow Mask once you had all of the Dark Souls. I love laughing at the jokes Jonty tells even if I can recite their entire exchange from memory. I love trying to remember the locations and specific coffin gates of items. Simply put, I absolutely love this game. And I cannot wait for the remaster, and I've never been anywhere near this excited for a game at any point in my life. Thank you for watching.